So in November of 2019, I decided to work at a hospital.
So you've been doing security consistently, and unless you've been living under a rock, you know that 2020 had some healthcare snafus, let's say. So what was it like working in the hospital during pandemic, but also one of the most polarizing times politically? What is up, people? Welcome to Self-Defense from All Angles. This week we have the show my friend Shane. Shane is a security professional working in healthcare, and I was really excited to have him on the show because, as you all know, I'm constantly looking for guests that are actually working in the space. And I've known Shane for a long time, actually before Shane was us in security. Shane, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good to be here. I'm happy.
Yeah, it finally worked out. We had to do a reschedule and then everything fell apart. Shane, why don't you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I am a longtime martial arts nerd. I grew up wanting to be a Power Ranger, and I think that I am perhaps unusual in the security space because I've started fairly late. A lot of folks in hospital security are in their late teens and early 20s. And I kind of got into the work in my mid 30s. I was, as I said, I've been doing martial arts for forever. And I got roped in with the violence dynamics crew and kind of expanded to self-defense as a broader topic. And as I got more engaged with that, I started thinking, oh, maybe I know some things that I can actually put to use and help people with. And So in November of 2019, I decided to work at a hospital, and that's where it's been. It's been kind of a proving ground and an adventure for me, and hopefully it's been good for people I've interacted with along the way. That's been the goal, at least.
Right. So you've been doing security consistently, and unless you've been living under a rock, you know that 2020 had some healthcare snafus, let's say. So what was it like working in the hospital during a pandemic, but also one of the most polarizing times politically?
The pandemic was strange because my hospital emphasizes mental health. It's one of the largest, has one of the largest numbers of inpatient mental health beds in the entire Midwestern United States. And so that traffic during the pandemic actually cut off. We actually were really slow during the early and kind of up to the height of the pandemic. But in regard to the murder of George Floyd, a lot of the ramifications of that are being felt more now that things have restored to normal in terms of traffic to the hospital. And the hospital is a big bureaucratic machine, and it takes forever for them to do anything.
Right.
And especially if the hospital in particular has not yet been sued for the precipitating incident. So what it's meant is, in the very least, a lot of consciousness, and I might even say just fear around use of force, both from, there's always a kind of, I think, been a concern when it comes to folks in security or people who use force. There's always a concern about, what are we justified to do? How do things look to observers? But I think that the public is more, it's conscious in a certain sense. They are more aware that violence happens and sometimes it's bad, but I kind of wish we would go a little deeper in terms of what people know and understand about the professional use of force and what violence looks like.
Right.
But I would say that there is, to some extent, still an expanded awareness in spite of the fact that it doesn't go as far as I might like.
Well, that makes sense. So if I can paraphrase what you're saying, during the pandemic, people were less annoying than they are now. Like you're saying, you're feeling the ramifications more now that there's a sense of normalcy again than during the actual height of the pandemic.
Well, so, the immediate impact of the issues with George Floyd were that anytime we went hands-on with anybody in the hospital, they immediately couldn't breathe.
Right.
that's just something we noticed an uptick in, is that people would claim to not be able to breathe.
Right.
And, and that's not to diminish it or say one thing one way or another. But that was the kind of immediate fact of the matter. It's more in terms of policy that the changes have happened recently. The hospital has revamped their use of force policies so as a large mental health hospital, we have psychiatric associates who are supposed to be kind of the first to deal with any sort of behavioral emergencies or violent events involving patients. And their whole use of force training has been revamped, and they're doing a whole lot to alter who responds to these kinds of things, what counts as a security incident versus a clinical incident. And as I said, that's kind of just rolling out now. That's the change we're seeing that's happening now.
Right. So in a post Floyd world, the changes were slow moving. Like you said, the hospital is a large bureaucratic machine, and it took a lot of time to implement the changes. But now the changes are being implemented. I don't know if do you feel, I don't want to get you in trouble, but like, are they? I'm sure it's not a smooth transition to the new policy. It never seems to be where it's like, oh, let's do this new thing, then everybody's on the program, right? So has it made your job more difficult because the policy changes are in place?
So there's a certain extent to which I can't answer the question because I didn't know what security work was like. I had a few months of security work prior to any of this happening. I can say that there is a lot more consciousness of what is referred to as patient-centered care.
Okay.
And
that was in quotes for the people listening to the audio. Shane did quotes under patient-centered care. Keep going.
And that refers to the fact that, people in the hospital, there are conditions under which we can detain individuals if they are deemed by a doctor to be a risk to themselves or to others. But beyond that, you're there to get help for something, and your rights should not be curtailed in any way.
Right.
And there's some kind of sticky area around where does a patient's right to not feel like they're in jail cross into them, when are they impinging on the rights of other patients? So a kind of concrete example of that is that over time, the hospital has encouraged staff not to redirect patients who are just kind of wandering the hallways to go back to their rooms.
Okay.
So that was kind of a standard security feature at the hospital earlier on, where patients could come out, ask questions of their nurses if they need water, need to go to the bathroom, whatever. But over time, they've come to allow just kind of hanging out or playing board games or whatever, just kind of in the main thoroughfares of the hospital, which is much more difficult from a security standpoint. And I would argue is of dubious value. There's one of the kind of unfortunate things that's happened in terms of the traffic at the hospital is that we now are getting a huge influx of minors who have been abandoned essentially and are boarding at the hospital for long periods of time. The longest I'm aware of has been at our hospital for over a year.
Interesting. Okay.
And so a lot of times they'll end up boarding in the adult ER for months at a time.
Huh.
And so there comes to be a question of, well, this patient is, we are legally required to keep them here. They, can't, they can't look out for themselves if they're out in the world. But being in the hospital, the normal rules would say, okay, that means you're in your room all the time. You don't get to see the sun. You don't get to get exercise, and so how do we accommodate the kind of needs of a human being with the fact that we're really not set up to have people live in that space for long periods of time?
Well, and that makes sense. It should be like a transitional place and some long-term care, but not an ER especially. That's very hard too, because like you're saying, the standard protocol is like stay in your room. It's easier for crowd control. The communal side of things, sure, it feels better on a service side, but is there a benefit to it, especially when safety is concerned? But like you said, that's the the subjective versus objective view of, are you in a prison? Because prisoners get at least an hour of daylight. So you can't keep somebody in their room in the hospital and then them not compare it to prison, right? That's impossible.
Sure. Yeah. And there's the other argument you hear on that is, well, it's also, not a daycare. It's not a dance hall. It's not, like it's there's just a lot of factors to weigh. And the kind of common answer seems to be to address it on a case-by-case basis. But when you're trying to proactively control an environment, it's really hard when there are no established rules.
Right. Is this boarding a relative? So you might have said it, but maybe I missed it. Is it a relatively new thing? I've never heard of somebody staying in a hospital indefinitely outside of like hospice or like long-term care. This boarding, is this like a relatively new feature?
It is a direct result of the pandemic, as far as I can tell, and as far as I understand it.
Oh, interesting.
And I couldn't speak to all of the dimensions of it throughout, group homes and orphanages, wards of the state. I don't know, but it is not something that was present prior to the pandemic.
And this is why I like to talk to people who are doing the job, because if I would have talked to somebody in security 5 years ago, this wouldn't have been a factor, right? So like, this is blowing my mind. I didn't know that there's people boarding in hospitals. And you said there was a legal right for you to keep them.
Well, I mean, they're not adults, so someone has to be legally responsible for them. Yeah, and some are wards of the state. Yeah, and I think that it's some kind of loophole where because there's a statute called EMTALA that I forget what it stands for, but it essentially says that we can't refuse anyone care based on whether or not they can pay, is the kind of fundamental statement of it. And kind of looped into that is this idea that a parent can bring their child to the hospital and we can't tell them no. And then if they leave, we can't release the child unless someone takes them, and we can't detain the parent.
Right.
So.
And there are people just abandoning their kids like at a fire station at the hospital.
Yes.
Wow. And just to be clear, because the show is international, big deal, brush off my shoulder. This is in Minnesota in the United States of America. This is the statute we're talking about. So maybe it's different in your country. Don't get at me in the comments. But for his experience and where he works, this is what's happening. And that's the segment we're looking at. So how are these borders, for lack of a better word, are they a problem when it comes to security? Like, are they their kids? Like, they're just running around? Like, what issues are you having with them potentially?
They are very frequently behavioral patients. The types of so it's right. So I mean, it's we'll get a lot of autistic patients who get left here who are violent or otherwise just difficult for their parents to control.
Right.
We'll get kids who are just haven't committed any crimes to go to jail for, but are kind of in that demographic.
Right. Yeah.
We'll get kids who are trafficking victims, or have just had really dysfunctional upbringings and their parents don't want them.
Yeah.
We'll get kids who just have crummy parents who, are done parenting and see you later. Yeah. There was one instance where a kid's parents dropped them off at the hospital and went on a cruise.
Like the hospital was babysitting.
Yes.
Did they come back for him?
Eventually.
After the cruise. I know that's not funny, but it's so absurd that laughter is my reaction. Does that make sense? Like, it's hitting my brain in such a way that I'm like, oh, okay. There's an issue here I think it's everywhere, where a lot of unhomed people use the ambulance as like a taxi. This sounds like the next level. It's almost like the hospital is becoming a hotel with a concierge service and a transport service and free room and board. Like that is wild. And for a cruise, I just can't get over that. That's so wild that people think that's an option. It is clearly, but to come to that conclusion, you had to have gone down quite the road of, let's just leave him at the hospital and see what happens, right? Like that's wild to me. So looking at this, so it sounds like the dynamic is switching, and especially because of the hospital you're working in. I think you're currently working there, right? Is the mental health hospital, right? So that's got to obviously present some other challenges, and I'm sure that changes your use of force continuum, right? Because where I did a little bit of hospital security as a security constant, and then a little bit of like traveling. Security constant just means I sat in the room with people that are potential flight risks, et cetera, et cetera. And I remember when I was working on the psych ward, everything was different, right? So like what you could do, what you could say, how you could act, the levels of force, like all of it had changed. So have you always worked with in a mental health hospital, or is this like a transitional point?
I mean, we serve a large mental health population. We
Right.
have lots of resources dedicated to mental health,
Yeah.
but it is just an urban hospital.
Oh, okay. So it's not a dedicated facility.
Right, correct. So we deal with a lot of mental health, but we have homeless folks who come in. We have folks who break their ankle. You know, it's as wide a population I think as you could serve in a major city.
Which makes this interview fascinating, gives me 100,000 more questions. So event happens, right? So there's an occurrence.
Mhm.
What is your first steps, or what is the first thing you assess in that situation? And does that, obviously that assessment will change what you do, right? So you walk in, if it's just like two drunk guys yelling at each other or a person having a mental health crisis, like what are the parameters? What do you go through in those situations?
A lot of it is just determining how much I need to be there.
Right.
I think that one of the distinguishing characteristics of security work, and I would guess, you working as a force professional, is that you kind of live in the after, right? We talk about how there's the fight's this much, and then you have this much before, and you have the after, and you're always considering, am I justified in using force? How much force is necessary? Who is observing? Like, and do I need to be conscious of, visitors or other patients? Or, it's a lot of environment management. And excuse me. So I guess that's the thing is that it comes up first is this a security question?
Right.
If somebody's just yelling,
yeah,
it usually draws my attention. I'll usually go see what's happening. But people yell at their doctors all the time, and so, is that great? I might like peek my head in and say like, hey, everything okay? But, that's the kind of highest level of force I want to use if I get involved at all.
Right.
And there's also, I guess, another unique dimension to the hospital is that we are a technically support staff for clinicians.
Right.
The only powers that I have at work that the average citizen doesn't revolve around the we call it a health officer authority, or a hold colloquially. And when a patient is put on a hold, I am allowed to physically detain them and to enact clinical orders for patients in the hospital. Like if a patient is refusing medication and a doctor orders it, I can physically restrain that person, right, so that the medication can be administered. I should never be doing that by myself, but
that happens.
Right. But yeah. So I guess that's the other thing, is that there's a big consideration of has clinical staff authorized me to do this?
Right.
There have been instances where I've seen someone get punched in the face, and we've taken control of them and put them on the ground, which is kind of our typical protocol. Sure. And someone on clinical staff will say, "Let them up. Right. We're not gonna seclude them. We're not gonna take any restrictive measures on this person."
Right.
Which leads to situations where you ask right up front, do I know where this person's going to go if I go hands on with them?
Right.
Are they going to go into restraints? Are they going to go into a room, or are they going to get up and fight me again because the doctor said so? So I guess that's another big consideration is, am I on the same page as the staff?
I think there's three things you said here I want to walk out. So number one is living in the after. I really like the way you phrase that. And I think that's something that more people should do is live in the, if I do this, what will happen? Like, what is the consequence dominoes that happen after I do this? As a force professional, especially when you're duty bound, when you have to write a report, like you start to just naturally think that way. Right. And I think that's where a lot of self-defense instructors are trying to get their clients to do, right? Is this bar fight worth it? Is this road rage worth it? What are the aftermath events that are going to happen that might make you not looking like a punk in front of your wife of 30 years not worth it, right? Like people have these really strange reactions. I have them all the time because people assume for some reason that because I teach this stuff, I'm above it. And I am not, sir. I am in it, right? Yeah. So like, even when I was bouncing, that was still like, you saw like every day, because you can have a bad day. You can be tired. Today, I'm on very little sleep. So if somebody pissed me off, I'm not going to have the spoons, as the kids say, to deal with those situations, right? Like we're human beings. So living in the after, I think that's a lesson everybody should take here is think past your ego being satisfied. Think past the initial emotional reaction. What will happen and then, right? That and then is super important. And if you don't have hundreds of uses of force and report writing and supervisors talking to you and debriefing, you're not going to get that skill set. And then you might make a bad choice. Might, not always. Number two is, I really like you pointed out your powers, right? Like I used to make the joke that all of my authority came from a $25 shirt that said security on it, right? Like, and I had landlord power, which was I could treat the bar as if it was my own home. So I could throw people out. That's the authority, at least doormen and bouncers in Canada have, is I could act as if I'm the owner of the bar. Which though gave us a power above what you had is we were not subservient to, we were the ultimate decision makers, right?
Yep. And there are circumstances, there are circumstances where that is more true.
Right.
When somebody's not registered as a patient, then we drift more into that role, though there's still some slippage, which again is, that's something that I think that George Floyd played into, where there are optics about who wants to manage the potential fight,
right?
Because you know the hospital prefers not to have us drag people out,
sure.
But then there are people who need to be dragged out sometimes, and the cops don't want to do it either,
right?
So there's some negotiations and some maneuvering that's required to kind of navigate those situations. To go on a tangent.
Well, exactly, and that's perfect. That's what you're on the show for. That's so like I think that's what force people forget about force professionals, and this is why also you have to watch out who you're learning from, right? Because if the person you're learning from had authority, duty, charter, right, whatever, I don't know what's called in the US, we call it the charter up here. The power of the charter is how police arrest. They might have different affordances and different things that they could do, and they default to that you as a civilian or a security guard or a bouncer might not be able to do, right? So really pay attention to that. But yeah, I think it's interesting with the, like you mentioned, the support staff side is that was the best part about being a bouncer because, and you have to look at why. And the reason why is in the bar industry, tips are the engine that make it run. So bartenders want to get people so drunk to give money to each other. So they'll say, don't throw them out. So we had to have the authority to be like, nope. Because we weren't working off of tips. We were outside of the economy, right? So we could drag them out. Where in this situation, of course, a doctor should know more about the patient than the random officer that walks into the room. So I don't think people think about this stuff enough, where like these rules are in place and these powers are given in theory for decent reason. At least there's some thought put into it, right?
Well, and there's a saying that comes up way too much, which is that there's a lot of gray area.
Yeah.
And like, there are always cases where it seems like the rules ought to be different.
Sure.
Right. There are always cases where you'll look at a patient and you'll be like, he's been tearing up the ER for 3 hours and he like is obviously just doing it to be a jerk,
right.
Like I had a guy who assaulted me a while back, and I'd been talking to staff for literally a day beforehand, trying to figure out why the hell we didn't discharge him.
Right.
But we never did.
Right.
So there's always this kind of weird slippage between how the rules are kind of established and what they mean in practice.
Right. And then I think that also comes down to the exceptions shouldn't always change the rule if the exceptions are so rare, right? Like people our brains are negatively wired. They have negativity bias. So we remember the bad stuff. You don't remember the 800 times the policy worked. You remember the one time it didn't work. You're like, we got to change this shit. You're like, but do you? Or was this a shitty day and there's no policy that's going to work? I'm not defending the policy. I just, there's, you know what I mean? There's like both sides of this. I remember because I still teach baby bouncers. And when I say baby, 18 is legal drinking age here. So I have 18-year-old kids being like, oh, I'm the boss now. I'm like, oh my God, I was you. I get it. I know why all doormen roll their eyes at me. I'm at that point now. But like these people, these young people are making these decisions and they believe they're better than the conventional wisdom. And sometimes they are, but that's also an exception, not the rule, right? Most of the time, they're just, oh, I could do this better. It's like, obviously, all of us thought of that too, bro. And it didn't work for us on that same point, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So you're obviously finding security work fulfilling because you're continuing to do it. You said you don't really know a lot of what happened before, but you probably have guards who have a bit more, who've been on the job longer. Have they brought things up that they think have changed, whether for the better or for the worse, post George Floyd, especially because you're in the epicenter of where that happened?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like if you go back maybe a decade or so, it was the Wild West there.
Yeah, like everyone.
Right. So they'll talk about, I mean, the way it's set up now, like I said, we have teams of psych staff who kind of help to manage patients and in many cases allow us to be more proactive by, we have a patient who might escalate and potentially become violent, but we can address like things that they need. And, we can be more carrot, less stick.
Right.
But a decade ago, there was, one security officer in the ER, and then, he had backup somewhere in the hospital.
Sure.
And so, probably force was used a lot more often, and the level of force was probably a lot higher because they also have implemented shortly before I got there, we got tasers, we got pepper spray.
Okay.
And previously that was hands-on and baton.
Yeah, right. The old stick.
Yeah. So yeah, literal stick. But so I think that many have lamented that. There's an inclination in established security folk to, just assume that you could give somebody a good ass whooping and it would, cure cancer,
Yeah.
But and I think that they tend to agree that the current situation is at least one for growing pains within hospital security, that it is general. I mean, if you look at the number of assaults on staff by patients, on patients by patients, the number of injuries that have happened as these changes have rolled out in my hospital, it seems to me to be unquestionably higher.
Right.
I haven't looked at data for it.
Yeah.
I can only say I read this many reports that feature these kinds of things.
Yeah.
So it seems to me that it is inarguably less safe, and it's a matter of what trade-offs are we getting for that, and what trade-offs can we expect to see down the line as we figure out what this new kind of less restrictive environment looks like.
Yeah. And is that a cultural shift or is it a policy shift, right? Like, are people just less respectful now than they were 10, 15 years ago?
Yeah. Well, and one could lead to the other, right? If, there are certain kinds of people who, if they realize they have more leeway, they're going to take it.
That is correct. Yeah.
And so I think that is a pervasive attitude among all personnel. I would venture to say that the ones who've been there longer are a little bit better at going with the flow, if only because their retirement depends on it.
And that's the key to all humanity, is when is my payday coming? All right, Shane. That's it for the free show, everybody. Shane, thank you so much for your time. So I got a book coming out. I do my promo first because people listen. I got a book coming out. It's supposed to be out now. It's not. I'm looking at, just some stuff happened. It was summer and my kid was here and I didn't feel like working. So I didn't. I had money in the bank and I got lazy. That's how I work as a human being. So I have less money in the bank now. So my motivation is higher. I'm hoping, I'm working on it over this next month, ideally end of the year, but I would want to say October, but I'm really sick of promising it and not delivering it. But I want you to know it's not like in my head. It's first draft is done. I'm just going through it and changing it. Like it is a book. It's just not ready for public consumption yet. So it is coming soon. Thank you to all the people who pre-ordered it. You can pre-order if you want to. You get a signed copy. Or you can just get it when it comes out. There's no rush on it. Timeline of Self-Defense. Do you want to promote anything?
I study jiu-jitsu at the Keishoukan Dojo based out of MKG North in Mounds View, Minnesota. You should check those people out. They're great.
Awesome. Kasey Keckeisen is one of your instructors. We actually have him coming on the show in the next couple of weeks talking about his tier program. I'm excited to hear about that and the recovery. And also, Kasey fits the criteria if he's still doing the job. So I really wanted to have him on the show because he has those changes as well. Shane, thank you so much for your time. Listeners, thank you so much for listening to podcast, sharing, subscribing, being on Patreon, all that stuff. We're going to jump over to Patreon right now for the extra content with Shane. Don't forget, so these will be coming a little bit more consistently. I want to get to the end of season 2 as quick as possible, but also I'm asking people on the Randy King Live page. So if you're on Facebook, because you're at that age demographic, my daughter makes fun of Facebook. But if you're on that age demographic, jump on the Randy King Live community. I'm asking people what changes you want to the show, what people you want to have on it, etc. I want to do some tweaks for season 3. We're starting to get sponsors now and people are paying me. So I want to really bring the numbers up. We're done. Thank you, Shane. We're going to Patreon. We'll talk to you all next week? ? Oh, Shane, I like the visual.